Hello everyone, my name is Lisa.
My name is Robin.
And my name is Adiba.
And this is the Asian American Brainstorm.
Hi, and welcome to our episode about Larry Itliong, one of the most influential figures in labor union history. He led an incredibly accomplished life, including helping create and lead the United Farm Workers alongside Cesar Chavez. So we hope that this podcast will do his life and legacy justice. Larry Itliong was born October 25th, 1913, in San Nicolas, which is a small town in the northern region of the Philippines, about 3 hours north of Manila. His entire life, he dreamed of coming to the U.S.
At the time, the Philippines was an American colony, and there was heavy U.S. propaganda that encouraged large-scale immigration to the West Coast and Hawaii. A couple things the U.S. did to encourage this were that they had many Filipinos taught English, and they had many school kids recite the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance in class. In fact, if you go to the Philippines today, English is very clearly spoken by most Filipinos. They also had Filipinos granted U.S. citizenship automatically through the Immigration Act of 1917. Interestingly, this barred other Asians from entering the U.S. As Filipino immigration rose and other Asian immigration fell, U.S. farmers started turning to Filipino immigrants as a source of cheap labor, since the Filipinos were arguably citizens already.
Yeah, that's super exploitative. Those Filipino immigrants were mostly farm workers, also known as Manongs, and Larry soon joined the Manong community. At just 14 years old, he moved to the U.S., and started moving up and down the West Coast as basically a child laborer. He was incredibly smart. For instance, he was a polyglot who was fluent in multiple Filipino dialects, as well as Spanish, Cantonese, and Japanese.
That's really impressive. I wish I knew that many languages. I don't. I also think it's very impressive that he did it in the time era that he did, because it's not like there's that much infrastructure for picking up a new language, unlike today.
Exactly, and especially when you add in the fact that he dropped out of school after 6th grade to move to the U.S., like, this was probably all languages that he either picked up just, like, in those first 6 years of school or just along the way, which is, again, very smart. Also, fun piece of trivia, he lost 3 fingers in an Alaskan salmon cannery, and for the rest of his life, he was known as 7 fingers, which is a pretty strong image.
The injury itself doesn't surprise me as much, mostly because, one, I know that era was way worse than today in terms of labor conditions in general. Add to that the fact that he was a child laborer and an immigrant in the U.S. It doesn't really surprise me that he got this injury.
Yeah, working conditions for immigrants, especially back then, were pretty terrible.
So the Manong community, which Larry was part of, made up a huge proportion of California's farm workers, and they were heavily exploited and discriminated against, as you all mentioned. And as a result, Filipinos in California really paved the way in unionization efforts among farm workers in the 1930s and 40s.
And as I mentioned earlier, Filipino men were used by farm owners as a legal substitute for cheap Asian labor.
They were paid only $1 per hour with no benefits, and the farm owners didn't fear a strike because at the time, Asian immigrants were known as politically silent.
Yeah, and that perception kind of persists today, doesn't it, with the model minority myth and the idea that Asian Americans will excel in the existing structures despite, like, political obstacles because they'll just stay silent on those obstacles. But then and now, that myth has not been true. For instance, since the 1900s, Japanese and Filipino farm workers have been organizing and gaining wage increases in Hawaii. And Larry Itliong himself is the prime example of why Asian Americans were not this politically silent group.
When the Filipinos arrived to the U.S. and started their work, they were often segregated into communities called Little Manilas, after Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Unfortunately, by the broader American citizenry, they were often referred to as Chinatowns.
That's just so classic. That kind of ignorance about, we don't care if they're Filipino or Korean or Japanese or whatever. To them, they were just like, all Chinatowns. That's it.
They even had laws preventing Manongs from marrying outside their own race, and U.S. laws restricted Asian women from entering the country. Because of all this, the generations of Manongs coming since the 1800s were known as the Lost Generation. But luckily, Larry still got married 6 times and had 7 children.
So he clearly wasn't missing out. I don't want to read too much into someone's personal life, but I think it's just very revealing of his personality that he was able to circumvent that law and still get, married so many times and live his life.
He definitely had game. So it looks like we have this incredibly smart and tough community organizer whose community is being systematically exploited by rich, white farm owners. What did Larry decide to do then?
Oh, Adiba, you know that Larry fought back. So throughout the 1950s, Itliong was leading a bunch of different unions and Filipino organizations throughout California, Washington, and Alaska. I won't go into all of them, but basically he was in 5 different cities at once just fighting for people's rights. The most important one was in 1965 when he became the leader of the AFL-CIO union, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or the AWOC, which was mostly made of Filipinos who had come to the U.S. in the 1930s. As the leader of the AWOC, he had his first taste of success in early 1965 when he helped win higher wages for Manongs after a strike against the Coachella Valley grape growers. After that, the farm workers followed the grape picking season north to Delano Valley, where they discovered that farm owners were paying well below the federal minimum wage and below what they had been getting in Coachella Valley. And so, on September 8, 1965, the AWOC voted to strike against the Delano grape growers. On the day of the strike, the Manongs started picking grapes as normal. Then a signal was fired and 1,000 men walked off the fields, leaving the grapes to rot under the hot California sun. The Delano grape strike is a pivotal moment in labor union history for 3 reasons. First, it helped create the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, one of the largest unions of agricultural workers at the time. Second, it was one of the earliest nationwide boycotts for workers' rights, most of which were planned by Larry Itliong as the UFW's boycott coordinator. And third, it achieved an unprecedented collective bargaining agreement for its workers. Although the strikers maintained a position of nonviolence throughout the strike, the farm owners instantly responded with violence. Grape farms and grape companies would hire police officers and criminals to break up the strike by force. So you had criminals out there beating up strikers, you had police arresting as well as beating up the protesters. You had farm owners driving trucks towards them to break them up and spraying them with pesticides. Just a laundry list of absolutely horrible things that they did to keep them down.
That's crazy how they couldn't even protest without people there reacting. And it reminds me how even today we're supposed to be able to protest peacefully in this country, yet police and other people will try to attack protesters.
Yeah, it's really terrible how basically protesting is a fundamental right, but if you don't protest in a way that aligns with the powers that be, then suddenly you get violently reacted to. So for instance, I was in one of the BLM protests during the June of 2020 in Philadelphia, and literally I saw with my own eyes somebody driving their car into a bunch of protesters. There was a fleet of police, bike police, and they did not care. They just kind of stood there watching. They did nothing. It was horrible.
Oh my God. I can't believe you had to experience and see that.
It really sucks that even back then through now, protesting is not seen as nonviolent protests still get broken up very violently.
Honestly, one of the main reasons why I think that this protest was able to be so successful despite all of these very hostile countermeasures was that the strikers were all older. They were 50 or older. No families due to the anti-miscegenation laws. And so they were really willing to risk everything in this fight for higher wages.
That's so true. At that point, they had nothing to lose. This was also during the era of civil rights protests. And so I think the labor organizers learned a lot of lessons from how the civil rights protests and civil rights organizing was occurring in the country at that time. So they were able to really get the community fired up and working together in a way that is just awe-inspiring, I think. Another tactic that farm owners used during this time was they hired Mexican laborers to scab the strike. So pitting Mexican and Filipino farm laborers against each other was a common tactic used at the time because as soon as one group started striking, then they could just hire the other group and pay them slightly more to keep them happy. And then And that way, they never had to actually raise wages for anyone. They could just temporarily bribe people into working for them. And so this happened in both directions and really heightened racial tensions between the two groups at the time.
That almost reminds me of Asian versus Black dynamics in the US today. Between the model minority myth and all these other structural implementations that the US had, seemed purposeful, that it was creating a system where more tension would be brought up between the Asian community and the Black community within the United States. We're still working with that today. We're working against it, trying to grow.
It really is similar, which is surprising because both groups have the same goal. They just want to be treated equally in this country.
That's such a good point, Adiva. And you know what? That's exactly what Larry also recognized. So he decided at this time to speak directly with Cesar Chavez, who led the National Farm Workers Association at the time, to try to forge a solidarity between the Mexican and Filipino farm workers. Initially, Chavez was a little reluctant for there to be a strike at all, but Larry went ahead and started a strike anyway. So Chavez had to hold an emergency conference of all the NFWA members, and a week later, the Mexican farm workers voted in favor of joining the AWOC on the picket line, which was a monumental achievement.
There's a saying, it's ask for forgiveness, not permission, and I definitely think Larry employed it successfully in this case.
What a guy.
Sounds about right.
So, what came out of the Delano grape strikes?
The AWOC and NFWA actually merged in 1966, forming the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. Chavez was named the director, and Itliong named the assistant director, and later the national boycott coordinator. While Itliong was the boycott coordinator, the Delano grape strike gained a lot of national attention for its use of consumer boycotts.
And thanks to all of that hard work, in 1970, a collective bargaining agreement was reached with 26 different grape growers, the first of its kind. It gave time pay increases, health insurance, unemployment, paid vacation days, and other various benefits.
Yeah, and those were all hugely beneficial, but Filipinos ended up getting the short end of the stick. The new contracts implemented what was called a hiring hall system. This system was intended to end the farm workers' migration cycle for more efficient harvests. However, what ended up happening was it split the Filipinos who were migrant laborers, and they were no longer able to gain employment benefits because they didn't have enough tenure with any one employer to gain them. So, in 1969, Larry stepped down from his role in the UFW due to disagreements about union governance and his belief that the union was not willing to support Filipinos.
I understand that the Filipinos definitely kind of got, screwed over, for lack of a better term, with this whole situation with the Delano grape strike and this whole system that's rigged against them. But I'm curious, why else did he think that the union itself was not willing to support the Filipinos?
That's a great question. So there were a lot of different factors, including the actual collective bargaining agreement they achieved. But part of it was because the Filipinos were a relative minority, they had fewer representatives within the union, and as a result, didn't get their voices heard as much as Larry would have liked. So what happened in the collective bargaining agreement was pretty much echoed throughout the union's activities.
What you were saying about the union not kind of hearing the Filipinos' voices because they had fewer people, but also it almost reminded me of the whole Asians are silent myth, that we don't really talk or speak up if things are being unjust. So that whole myth, I'm almost wondering whether maybe that had some play within the union even. Even though this is supposed to be a group of people who are united against, fighting this corrupt system, and a lot of different minorities are within this union, maybe there was some play there that caused the Filipinos to, not be really taken seriously.
I 100% agree. That's a really interesting take. Even if the Filipino laborers themselves weren't being silent, the perception of them as silent could in turn effectively silence them. And I think one thing that really supports that idea is actually it was a representative from the AFL-CIO, so the larger parent organization, who came in, stepped in, and basically appointed Cesar Chavez as the director because he recognized that there was just a much larger Mexican immigrant laborer population within the UFW. And so he was trying to represent that. But did that also in turn cripple the Filipino voice representation as a result? Larry decided to channel his activist tendencies towards a lot of other organizations. So, for instance, he helped to secure housing, actually, for the aging Filipinos using funding from the UFW in what's now called the Palo Agbayani village. And this was really major because after the Filipino laborers were no longer able to work for grape pickers, they were also kicked out of their housing that was provided by the grape pickers. And so they're effectively homeless, and it took a long time for them to set up some kind of community housing to make sure that they were taken care of into their old age, and Larry played a pivotal part of that. He was also on the founding board of the California Rural Legal Assistance, which was part of LBJ's War on Poverty, and he was a delegate in the 1972 DNC. In 1977, Larry Itliong died of Lou Gehrig's disease in Delano, California, the same small town where he and 1,000 other grape pickers helped kickstart a national labor movement, securing workers' rights for hundreds of thousands of farm workers across the West Coast and strengthening the Filipino community in Delano.
That's so great to hear about all his impact on the community. So we now have this picture of Larry Itliong, his life. What do you all want to take away from this?
So actually, my stepfamily is from the Philippines, and I asked them if they knew Larry Itliong. My stepmother was the one who, it's their generation that, migrated, and my stepsister was born in the U.S. along with, my step-cousin came over as a small child. And so I asked them, my stepmother knew who Larry Itliong was. My stepsister and step-cousin did not. I suspect that it may be mainly a regional thing, since I'm originally from Florida, and it also partially may be generational because my stepmother was one of the generation who came to the U.S. as an adult, so maybe they heard about it more in the Philippines than in Florida. There is a kind of newly minted Larry Itliong Day in California, which is devoted to remembering him and his life's work. And so that is pretty awesome. I personally think that not only should California Filipinos, not only should they know who he is, but it should really be anyone who's looking for a role model for how to really unite your community and stand up for your rights.
East Coast schools should definitely have this day too, because growing up, I did not know Larry Itliong until now.
Same. It might be a Florida thing, to be honest. I had never heard of Larry Itliong prior to this podcast episode, doing the research for it. I had learned about Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers in high school, but no mention of all the, not only Larry, but also the innumerable Filipino organizers who helped contribute to labor history in America. And yeah, I agree. We should definitely have Larry Itliong Day across the country. Personally, I definitely want to take away the solidarity that Larry was able to build not only within the Filipino community, but also across the Mexican and Filipino communities together. I think that in the past few years, one thing I've been really working on is trying to come to terms and understanding my identity better as an Asian American. And part of that is trying to seek out community and finding ways to become a positive and active member of those communities. And so seeing how Larry Itliong moved over here and pretty much instantly, a year in, at just the age of 15, he was already organizing and already participating in strikes and finding his community and agitating alongside them is really inspiring.
I loved learning about all the things that he advocated for. It just reminded me that even though we can't necessarily rebuild the system, we definitely can at least try to make a change, because if we don't, then things will always just stay the same. So as a reminder to myself to definitely educate myself more, others, and continue to protest or however ways I could think of to try to make a difference.
Absolutely. All right, so that's Larry Itliong, Union Hero. If you enjoyed learning about important Asian Americans in history, please subscribe to our podcast and leave a rating. If you'd like to read personal stories from the Asian American community, visit our website, www.whereimreallyfrom.com. Thank you for listening.